Our next panel is entitled The U.S. and China in the 21st Century. Can the world's two biggest economies figure out a way to cooperate and compete? Our panelists this evening are Charlene Barshefsky, former U.S. Trade Representative and Senior Partner at WilmerHale; Gary Cohn, former Assistant to the U.S. President for Economic Policy and former Director of the NEC; Kai-Fu Lee, Chairman and CEO of Sinovation Ventures; and Fang Xinghai, Vice Chairman of the China Securities Regulatory Commission. Our moderator is Andrew Browne, Editorial Director of Bloomberg New Economy Forum.
Fang Xinghai, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You've spent the better part of 2 decades working with U.S. companies, with CEOs, with investors, with regulators. I think you were 5 years at the Shanghai Stock Exchange. You were 7 years with the Shanghai government, working to turn Shanghai into an international financial center. And now you're a top securities regulator in Beijing. In other words, you've seen the whole arc of the U.S.-China economic and financial relationship from a promising, hopeful start to where it is now, which is basically in ruins with neither side talking to each other. Where did it all go wrong? How do you date this? What was the event, or what was the series of events? What was the individual or the individuals who started all this? What's your analysis?
No, well, first of all, the economic relation is not completely in ruin. For example, in the financial sector, in China and the United States are cooperating quite well. But you have your point. And I think the difficulties began about 4 or 5 years ago when the United States suddenly realized that China had become a very large economy and is growing, quite fast. So the U.S. wanted to redress the economic relation between China and the U.S. And I sensed in negotiations with the U.S. negotiators, I sensed that there was a demand from the U.S. side to get something from China quickly. That they wanted China to change certain things really quickly. So that was one reason that caused the troubles that came after that. And another reason I can think of is that the U.S. has always dealt with China with this strategy, the so-called engage and hedge strategy. And when China was not that big, when the Chinese economy was not that strong, the engage part was more prominent. But then, after China became sort of more prosperous, the hedge part became more prominent. So when you hedge and then you want something quickly from China, that was difficult for China to deal with. I think that was the reason. Now, and just to anticipate, with the later part of the discussion, in this new administration, I think the U.S. needs more patience. And one question that I would like to ask our panelists is that does the U.S. Want China to prosper? Does the United States want China to become a very big economy and sometimes could be even bigger than the United States? Or is the U.S. Kind of determined to prevent China from becoming so?
Fang Xinghai, that's a great question. But let me ask you a similar question. Let me ask you this. Do you think that the U.S. does not want China to succeed, that the U.S. is simply not ready to cede its position as number one in the system to China, to a country with a communist government?
Well, I mean, the U.S. is a very large country, so we have all kinds of different people. I think among the panelists today, they will be very happy to see China grow to be bigger than the U.S. But I think for some Americans, yes, they're not happy with that prospect.
I think we might have lost Fang Xinghai's audio.
No, I finished.
Oh, you fit. Let me before I get to Gary Cohn, one more question. Let me put a theory to you. It's a very popular. I'm sure you've heard it many times. Very popular outside China. And in this theory, the key date is 2008 and the global financial crisis. And China comes to the conclusion that the United States has no idea what it's doing. It's almost tanked the global economy, and it never really recovers. And China goes from strength to strength. And after a while, it thinks, well, why should we be bashful? And so it begins to behave in a much more assertive way on the economy, with foreign investors, in technology, and in many other domains. What does that narrative get wrong? What does it get right? Or what's it missing?
Well, I don't think that after the financial crisis, Chinese policymakers and academics come to the conclusion that somehow the U.S. is finished. The U.S. economic model is no longer going to work. I don't think that is the case. Now, you said that China somehow become more assertive. I think when your economy becomes so big and your interests are all over the world, you have to protect your own interests. And some people say previously China somehow adopted a kind of lay low policy, right? You don't hide your light, that kind of thing. Um, I think China has become so large right now. You just cannot hide. I mean, even if you lay down, the bullet will still hit you. And rather than being hit by a bullet when you lie down, you would rather stand up and just protect your legitimate interests.
Gary, you had a front row view of the evolution of the China policy of Donald Trump. Indeed, you were part of the policy apparatus as the chief economic advisor to the president. It seems like President Trump's early intention was to rebalance trade, and then it morphed into something quite different that started to look a bit like containment. Talk us through the policy debates that you were part of in the White House.
Well, I'm glad you said the word debates, because I think there were debates within the White House what the ultimate objective was. I think the Trump administration started out looking at the trade deficit with China and said that this is not in the best interest of American workers and jobs in America. And the premise was, how do we bring back jobs to America, and how do we return manufacturing jobs back to the United States? I think that was the basic premise. What you find is it's not that easy. You can't just instantaneously relocate manufacturing from one country to another country. These things take long periods of time to build the factories, to build the environment, to get people to want to work in those factories. And simultaneously, during this period of time, if you think of what was going on in the United States, a little over a year ago, we were in a full employment picture in the United States. So even if you were able to relocate manufacturing back to the United States, who would have worked in those factories? We would not have had the labor pools to put people back in those factories. So there was this discussion about trade imbalances and how do you fix those. I think the Trump administration decided to use tariffs, something that I didn't agree with. I don't think tariffs work. They tried to put tariffs on Chinese imported goods to make them more expensive. Unfortunately, it didn't stop the import of any good from China. In fact, we've had record trade deficits up till months ago. All we did was put a consumption tax on the U.S. consumer, making those goods more expensive. But it never at any point created the economic incentive for someone to move manufacturing here to the United States. And then there became this whole discussion about reciprocal and fair and open and honest, which was a second derivative, I think, of the original discussion. It was about Chinese capital investment and Chinese capital flow and Chinese being educated in the United States, and we having very open borders for capital flows, and China having very closed borders for capital flow. And Americans' capital couldn't flow easily into China. And I think the Trump administration said, look, we don't want to allow the Chinese to be able to buy our most prized assets if we can't buy prized assets in China, which, of course, as our first speaker said, China is a country where things take a long time. They evolve. They've got a very long history. They remind us of their long history. That wasn't going to change overnight in China, which then morphed into this whole discussion about forced technology transfer and access and technology and what was going on in that area. But I really think the whole issue stemmed from the trade deficit that Donald Trump personally did not care for.
To what extent was Trump's policy the result of hawkish policy advisors? To what extent was he playing to his base, to his popular base? And what was the U.S. business community saying to him?
So I think, as in most White Houses, there's a diversity of opinion. There were clearly some very hawkish opinions in the White House. And I guess you would say there were some very dovish opinions in the White House. You know, I had an opinion where, very, very honestly, where I said, look, we can put tariffs on the Chinese. We're still going to import the goods we need from China because these are basic goods that American consumers want and need and can't live without, and they're going to pay for them. So there was a dichotomy of opinions here. There was also political rhetoric. I think no one should look past that. The Trump constituency felt that we had lost a lot of jobs to China, manufacturing jobs, that America was not the manufacturing country we once were. That said, we have become much more of a services country where we provide services to the rest of the world. And in my opinion, a good deal for us would be a deal where we could import cheaper goods from China, but export our services. And I thought TPP was something where that would have been a helpful start.
Charlene, where do you think it all started going wrong? You brought China into the World Trade Organization in 2001. This was supposed to be the beginning of a reform process in China. China was supposed to become more liberal economically and, depending who you talk to, even politically more liberal too. What happened?
I think what happened is this. China came into the WTO on the basis of autonomous liberalization of its economy, as well as undertaking an extraordinary array of obligations, including a number of obligations that were specific just to China. And its reform and opening continued until about 2006, 2007, when it began to sputter, and under Xi Jinping, it largely stopped. And in its place were a series of economic measures, starting with indigenous innovation, that began China's divergence from market economy norms, rather than what had been, from the time of Deng Xiaoping, movement toward convergence with those norms. What you have now, after many years and many programs, is a scale player in China with an economic model that is statist, it is state-led and state-fueled, and which is antithetical to market-based economic norms. Xi Jinping joins that issue, and you see it in the 14th five-year plan, by reiterating the importance of Chinese tech dominance by reiterating the importance of self-sufficiency, including now China's self-sufficient supply chains, which are deemed to be secure and controllable, as well as China that is beginning to remake the international system in a way far more compatible with its own interests. I agree with Fang Xinghai that one would anticipate that China would take a more aggressive stand, given its economic size, its importance globally, and given its own aspirations and ambitions. But the real problem here is the doubling down by China of an economic model that does not fit the obligations that it undertook, and that results in heavily mercantilist practices.
Let's turn to technology. Kai-Fu, we really are faced with an almost insuperable dilemma here. So many of the cutting-edge technologies in the world today, artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, have security as well as civilian applications. And as Henry Kissinger says, competition in these areas tends to become zero-sum, winner-take-all. How do you look at this question?
Well, I think China has gone through a phenomenal transformation from more of a copycat 10 or 15 years ago to really having had the opportunity to develop self-sufficiency in a lot of key technologies. The area I'm involved in, mobile internet and AI, are basically largely civilian-driven. Basically, is a virtuous cycle that began with a large market that attracted a lot of investors, many American investors, in Chinese entrepreneurs who have proven themselves to be tenacious, hardworking, and build amazing products that are now world-class and feeding to more data, which made available to artificial intelligence. And that has made China very, very competitive. A lot of people assume this was all constructed by the government, but in fact, it certainly began as building great products that have excellent product market fit. And the predominance of the people working on the technologies, building products, are domestic technologists working in domestic companies, selling to domestic customers. So I don't think the current belief that it's all governmental driven is accurate. I also don't think the belief that it's largely for use by government is accurate. Take a look at the largest concentration of AI expertise. They are in the likes of Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, and their products are for commercial use. So, and also I think there is a misconception that rather than the virtuous cycle I described, there are people who believe that China was merely a copycat and that it could be stifled with various measures that blocks the capital, market access, and IP and technology, then the Chinese innovations would be stifled. But in fact, I think it's a misunderstanding about the true virtuous cycle that China has created and has become an innovator. And if another country like the US wants to compete and against China, there's really no choice other than treating China as a worthy competitor, increase the funding of technologies, open up immigration to talents, and focus on building great products in the civilian space. And then in both countries, it will obviously spill over to some governmental use, but it's really a civilian competition in this case.
Yes, China is an incredible innovator, but China hasn't mastered semiconductors. And some hardliners in the US are saying, okay, this is a key vulnerability. Let's attack it. We can use this to bring down Huawei and other Chinese tech companies that we see as a security threat. From a tech perspective, semiconductors is where this relationship is unraveling. How do you see all that playing out?
I think that's a very simplistic view. There's no doubt U.S. is well ahead of China in semiconductor technologies. In some of the toughest areas, the most competitive space, the most difficult spaces, U.S. may be 10 years or further ahead on a country-to-country basis. But we should not forget that there are many other countries involved, and those countries do not want to be told that they can't deal with the world's largest market in China. And China is the largest buyer of semiconductors and equipment at over $1 trillion in 2019. And to date, in 2020, 25% of China's total imports from the US are in this sector. So I think it will seriously hurt the American companies doing business in this area. It will also force other countries to probably have to choose to reduce US dependencies so that they could sell to the Chinese companies that may be blocked or otherwise targeted by the American policies. So I think it would lead to a lose-lose. Both countries would lose a lot of business. Semiconductor is an incredibly intricately connected fabric of the globally. It's not just one business. There are foundries, fabless, and tools. And I think trying to pull this rug also potentially can accelerate China's own self-sufficiency by not depending on the US as the largest market. And it can potentially also cause tit for tat as China still has a lot of industries that Americans need, such as manufacturing, such as rare earth materials. I think it's incredibly dangerous to make this the primary thrust of technological competition.
Fang Xinghai, I asked Kevin Rudd this, and I'd like to ask you too. And I know that you're speaking in a personal capacity. You're not speaking on behalf of the Chinese government. Do you think that a President Biden offers an opportunity for a reset of U.S.-China relations?
I certainly hope so. Let me come back to some of the points that Kai-Fu just raised. I don't think China is striving for some kind of technological self-sufficiency or economic sufficiency, but China does not certainly does not want to be blackmailed economically by another country, right? Because we are determined to grow the Chinese economy further. But in terms of international cooperation, and then particularly in terms of cooperating with the United States, I think China is ready. I just listened to President Xi. He said 3-4 days ago in Shanghai that the Chinese economy certainly is a big ocean that allows us to be growing largely based on domestic demand. But he also said that the international economy is also a big ocean, and we are ready to go out and then also bring in foreign investment and foreign companies into the Chinese economy. So coming back to your question, whether President Biden offers an opportunity for a much better U.S.-China relation, I do think so, because between the U.S. and China, there are so many things we can do. Some people, Gary, I guess, mentioned a manufacturing job in the United States. I think in this area, a large number of Chinese companies can help the U.S. Achieve more manufacturing jobs in the U.S. because they are ready to invest into the United States if they are not prevented from doing so. And then maybe another area that China and the U.S. can cooperate is in the infrastructure area. China has a lot of expertise in building infrastructures, and the U.S. needs a lot more infrastructure construction, and China can help out in this area as well. Now, of course, in technology, in financial services, in education, all these areas, the U.S. can do a lot for China. So we can sit down and work well with each other the only one sort of worry that I have on this regard is that this current administration may be also too much in a haste to achieve something because it only has 4 years to go, and in the U.S. system, you have to worry about the next election, and then the current administration may also want to achieve something too quickly, and that may cause some problem.
Gary, what are the lessons that Joe Biden should take from the Trump administration on how not to handle the China relationship?
Well, look, I'm also optimistic that the Biden administration can work things out or attempt a new beginning with the Xi and with Xi and the Chinese. We both need each other. I mean, we have to start with this premise and this understanding that the China-US relationship is extremely important and it's vital to both countries and both countries' well-being and the success of their economy. So I think President-elect Biden will come into this understanding that. So when you understand that that's a basic premise, you then work from there and say, where can I start improving things around the edges? How can I make them better? I don't think there's a big bang win here for either side. I think we can incrementally try and improve things around the edges. We can open more access for US companies in China. And in China, we can open more products into the US, and we can continuously move the ball forward on both sides of the ledger. And I think President-elect Biden, if he works in that direction to what's best for the US and what also works for China, because it will be best for them, I think there's a lot that could be achieved.
Charlene, should Joe Biden administration drop the tariffs? They haven't worked, have they? It's a tax on Americans, and China's trade surplus with the U.S. is bigger than ever.
So I agree with that, and I agree with Gary's points about the effects of tariffs, which of course are not paid by China, but are in fact paid by the U.S. consumer and the U.S. Importer. But I think that Xi Jinping carries a heavy load. There's an awful lot of talk about what should Joe Biden do. I would suggest that it would be important for China to think about what Xi Jinping should do. Remember that Joe Biden was in the Obama administration, which after 8 years of dialogue, endless meetings, endless series of engagements, 60 plus working groups, produced almost no result with respect to the key complaints the US had about the Chinese economy. It was not surprising that there was an explosion when Donald Trump came into office. The way he's handled the relationship, I think, is poor. But the fact that the underlying tensions were extremely high would have been the case whoever came into the White House at that point, largely because conditions on the ground in China were worse for multinationals over time, not better. So I think that it would be very important for Xi Jinping to also show good faith here. I do think Joe Biden, because he's not a flamethrower and he doesn't use a meat axe on policy, will be a more productive partner for Xi Jinping. But Xi Jinping needs to be a more productive partner for Joe Biden. And so the question that I would pose is, what can China do to reduce tension? And what can China do on the economic side that demonstrates significant good faith with respect to the complaints that the US and many other economies have?
Kai-Fu, what advice would you give to a Biden administration? There's a lot of talk about this concept of small garden, high wall, that both countries decide on those critical technologies that are absolutely vital for national security. They defend those to the death and collaborate in other areas. Is that a workable sort of idea, workable sort of solution?
Yes, I'm optimistic about that. Let me first explain my earlier comment about self-sufficiency was not that China was seeking to achieve that, but that any kind of semiconductor ban would force China to adopt that approach, which I don't think is productive for anyone. So on the constructive side, I'm quite optimistic about a few things. First is just that I think we need a few small wins to get things started. And I think in areas like fighting the pandemic, climate change, solutions for agriculture, elderly care, governance of AI and CRISPR are some of the easy areas to engage in and achieve some wins. I believe there's a great complementarity of China's strengths and US strengths. China has the world's best manufacturing, the largest market with the most data, and the fastest entrepreneurs. US has the world's best research, best education, best enterprise software. So there are many places the two countries could or should work together. Thinking about drug discovery, imagine if we had China's market and data and US's medical knowledge, what great accomplishments could be accomplished. So I'm quite optimistic that finding these small wins will get things started. But I think also looking at the longer term horizon, I think realizing that China is a worthy partner and competitor is an important step. And thinking about what is the biggest core strength of US, it is clearly the American research system and the fact that US draws from talent across the world. Right, U.S. has a smaller population, much smaller than China. So if each country only drew from its population, U.S. would not be the most innovative. And the success of the American industry owes in a great part to the immigrants who come to America, many on a student visa studying tech, and many return home, but also many stay. I was one of the beneficiaries of this open policy. I think it is a very critical underpinning of the American success to attract from a great pool of people worldwide, and then to provide the best education and research environment. I think focusing on that strength rather than trying to take more, zero sum and approaches to policy would be more productive for the new administration.
Fang Xinghai, do you see a resolution to the accounting issues around Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges? I know that you're responsible for that area of regulation. How important is it to China to make sure that problem is resolved?
It is important to us because we want Chinese companies to be able to access international capital markets. And we have every sincerity to resolve this problem. I think during the Biden administration, we should be able to resolve that problem because it is not an intractable problem. It's not that difficult to resolve it. All it takes is a goodwill from both sides and a willingness on both sides to really resolve it.
I would be remiss, Fang Xinghai, if I didn't ask you about the Ant Financial IPO. This was going to be the world's largest public offering, and then it was suddenly pulled. You're the securities market regulator. What did you see at the last moment that so worried you? And what signal does this give to foreign investors about the safety and security of the Chinese equity markets?
Well, Andy, all I can say is that international investors have responded to this move quite well because during the last week, we have seen a lot of inflows in the Chinese capital markets from international investors. And investors in Hong Kong, which is another market that Ant was supposed to list, have also done quite well. So we will see how international investors react to that. But so far, they have reacted quite well.
Will this IPO eventually go ahead? Can you share any kind of timetable with us?
I don't know. It depends on how the government, restructure our regulatory framework in terms of financial technology, and also depends on how the company reacts to the changing regulatory environment.
Gary, Ray Dalio thinks that global funds are massively underweighted China. He suggests a more realistic weighting would be 15%. I think now it's something like 3%. Does that sound about right to you? And is China, do you think, ready for that volume of capital inflows? Would you be concerned about financial stability in China?
Look, I think the world is underweight China because there's been very few ways to play China where international investors have the ability to play in a way that they feel safe, where they're not worried about getting their currency tied up, where they're not worried about the regulatory environment, where they're not worried about the accounting issues. To the extent that China or other markets like China become more transparent, more clear, and people aren't fearful of government intervention in the markets and they're not fearful of accounting issues, there will naturally be more flows into these markets. China is one that clearly is underweight vis-a-vis the size of the companies and the size of the population and the market.
We're running out of time. One final question, which comes from somebody in our audience. What do each of the panelists expect the U.S.-China relationship to look like in 4 years' time, heading into the 2024 U.S. elections? Charlene, would you like to have a go at that?
I think a relationship that was once cooperative, punctuated by occasional bouts of hostility, has become a relationship that's hostile, punctuated by occasional bouts of calm. My hope is that the calm aspects of the relationship will increase over the next 4 years. But I think the terms of competition between the two economies is being set. I don't see that competition lessening. My hope and belief is that the hostile rhetoric and the unnecessary invective will have been removed from the relationship so that its more positive aspects can come through.
Gary, what do you think the relationship?
I think I agree very much with Charlene. I think if we look at the actual relationship without the noise on top of it, 4 years from now, our relationship will be very similar. I think if you look at trade deficit and you look at flow funds and you look at foreign direct investment and markets being open and things like that, I don't think a whole lot will change. The Chinese don't move that quickly. What I'm optimistic on, and I'll try and be optimistic, is that the rhetoric and the tone of the rhetoric and the noise can be toned down. And that would be, to me, a big win.
Kai-Fu?
I hope we find some small wins that begins to build some level of trust, and that there will be a rule-based approach for the technological competition and cooperation that can happen at the same time.
The last word to Fang Xinghai.
Thank you. Certainly, China has every intention to improve the relation, to forge, a mutually beneficial relation with the United States. Now, China is steady, right? Sometimes our pace of reform is a little bit slow, but it's steady. So looking back over a 4-year period of time, I'm sure that you will see a huge progress in terms of reform and opening up in China. And so I sincerely hope that at the end of the 4 year of the Biden administration, U.S.-China relation will be at a much, much better state than it is today.
On that uplifting note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much.